Okay. Hi, looks like we're ready to get going. Hi, everybody. Welcome to day 25 of Career Connect at Home. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Simone St. Pierre Nelson. I'm a student at Gibson Neck High School in Issaquah and a youth producer with Radioactive Youth Media, which is the teen journalism program at KUOW Public Radio. I'm joined by Kelsey Kupfer, a program producer at Radioactive. Today, we're going to talk about public radio journalism and how you can build the skills that journalists use every day, listening closely, asking questions, and conducting interviews. A great thing about these skills is that they're applicable in any field, not just journalism. There will be time at the end of our session to ask us some questions. You can head on over to Career Connect at Home's Instagram page to submit your questions as we go along.
Just like Simone said, Radioactive Youth Media is the teen journalism program at KUOW Public Radio in Seattle. KUOW is a national public radio, or NPR station. We're 94.9 on the dial, and when you listen, you'll hear local, national, and international news and radio shows. Just like the Seattle Times or the Washington Post, KUOW is a news outlet where reporters, editors, and producers work to bring you the news every day. And if you listen to KUOW, you'll notice that you won't hear any commercials. That's what makes KUOW a public radio station. Instead of making money from advertisers, we're supported by our listeners. About 70% of KUOW's total budget comes from listener donations. So today we're going to share a little bit more about ourselves and our roles, and then we'll do a deep dive into the art of interviewing like a broadcast journalist. So Simone, why don't you start by telling us about the summer you spent making radio with Radioactive?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a youth producer at Radioactive. That means I've gone through the Radioactive Intro to Radio Journalism workshop, where I produced 2 podcasts and a feature story that played on KUOW.
So Simone, did you do any kind of journalism before joining Radioactive?
Well, not really. I've never been a member of a school paper. My only journalism and audio production experience before working with Radioactive were independent projects, where I messed around in Audacity and tried to emulate the style of podcasters that I liked. I think that journalism can feel unapproachable. I know that when I was starting to work with RA over the summer, there was a lot of self-doubt. I think with creative jobs like this, similar to novelists or musicians, there's a perception that you have to have it. But in my experience, there's no time that's too late to start working on journalistic skills. It's all about curiosity, storytelling, and empathy. And that's why I love it. What about you, Kelsey? How did you get into journalism?
So as a teenager, I did get to work on my high school newspaper, and that's also around the time that I started listening to NPR and podcasts. And I was like, oh man, like I really love this. I think that I could do this. I want to do this. So I studied radio journalism in college at the University of Missouri, which is in my hometown. And there I also interned with my local NPR station, KBIA. So Simone, you spent last summer reporting for KUOW. Could you tell us a little bit about what a day in the life of a reporter looks like?
Sure. I guess the first thing that I'd start with is that no 2 days are really the same. As a reporter, you have days both in and out of the office, and what they look like is also going to depend on your piece. Some of the things you can do with any piece in the office are research, writing a script, and editing your audio. Outside of the office, reporters might attend events, scout out locations for their next interview, and collect ambient tape to make your audio editing a little bit easier.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of being a journalist is getting to spend so much time out of the office, outside, in the community, talking to people and interviewing people. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about. So interviewing is simply the art of asking great questions and listening closely to the answers. So we're going to dive into some best practices of how to interview like a broadcast journalist. And we're going to start by listening to 2 short samples of interviews from public radio shows. And Simone, as you know, as we listen, we're going to invite everyone watching to think about what makes an interview starter and what makes an interview stopper. So by starter, we mean a question or something that the interviewer says or does that gets an interesting, compelling, emotional, detailed answer. And by interview stopper, we mean a question that gets an awkward silence or a one-word answer or an uninteresting answer. Sound good, Simone?
That sounds awesome to me. Yeah.
All right, so the first interview example we're going to share is from a public radio show that never aired. Seattle radio personality Luke Burbank is interviewing a band from Iceland called Sigur Rós. We're going to listen to just the first 2 minutes of the interview. Now remember, as we listen, we're going to see if we can identify what Luke does well and what doesn't work so well for him. So I'll go ahead and pull up here Luke Burbank's interview with Sigur Rós. It's about 2 minutes long. Here we go. I'm going to pause because our sound might not be working. So I'm going to try this one more time.
Okay.
All right. Okay, now I'm going to share Luke Burbank and we're going to make sure the sound's on this time. So here's Luke Burbank interviewing Sigur Rós.
Sigur Rós is Jon Bergersen on guitars and vocals, Kjartan Svensson on keyboards, Ori Pal Djarsson on drums, and Georg Holm on bass. How did I do with those names, guys?
That's pretty good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you start out playing this kind of music, or did you start out as a more, people might think, regular sounding band, and then did you kind of go here as you experimented?
I don't know. I think we probably just started out playing like this.
I mean, what was the first time that you guys sat down with your instruments and started playing? Did you have this thought, we want to create this very specific kind of music? Because the stuff that you make doesn't sound like a lot of other stuff that's out there. Or did you, I mean, did you get to that right away?
Yeah, I think we probably did. I don't think we didn't sit down and talk about, oh, we want to play this type of music or something. It just happened naturally.
And how do you guys create a song?
We
just sit down and create a song.
Does one person start playing one instrument and then everyone else starts to kind of add into that?
Yeah, kind of. Like that.
Yeah.
Did you think you would be the kind of band that sold 2 million records?
I don't think we don't really expect anything. So it's just, why not?
What did you guys, obviously at some point you decided to get in the same room and start playing music with each other. What was the motivation? You just wanted to make music?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically it. We want to make music.
All right, tough break there a little bit for Luke and Sigur Rós.
Ouch. Ouch. Every time I watch that clip, it somehow becomes more awkward for me.
And it's not all Luke's fault. The band has not given him a lot of information there. But I hope that we could identify some things that Luke did pretty well and some things that maybe he could have improved on. But before we get into talking about the interview starters and interview stoppers that we found, we're going to watch one more clip. Now, Luke Burbank is a professional radio host. This next clip that we're going to watch is from a Radioactive Youth Media student. So in Radioactive Youth Media's workshops, students go out to Pike Place Market or somewhere else in the community as one of their very first activities, and they have to interview a stranger. So our next clip is 1 minute long, and it is from a Radioactive youth producer named Claire Martin, and this is her very first interview. She's interviewing strangers out at Pike Place Market. Now, this interview took place around Valentine's Day, and so you'll notice that the topic is related to love and relationships. So here is Claire Martin interviewing a stranger. Again, it's about 1 minute long.
Excuse me, do you have a minute to talk?
Sure.
All right, thank you. I'm Claire. I'm an intern at KUOW, and we're doing a show on breakups.
You're what?
I'm an intern at KUOW, and we're doing a show on breakups.
Okay.
What's your name?
I'm Tish.
Can you spell that for me, please?
Tish.
Wonderful. And so, have you been in a relationship before?
Yes.
And so, in a previous relationship, or maybe even a current one, what was the exact moment when you knew your relationship was doomed?
When he didn't show up or call me on the date night that he was supposed to.
What was that date supposed to be?
We were just supposed to meet up for dinner, and he never called, and that was like the third time he had done it, so that was it. I was done.
How long ago was that?
Last week.
I'm sorry. And so how did you handle this?
I moved on. I don't worry about it. Just move on to something else. I don't let grass grow under my feet.
Thank you for talking to me today, Tish.
Thank you.
All right, so two really short interviewing clips, but I think that we can learn a lot from listening just to 2 minutes of interviews. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Simone. What did you hear that were interview starters?
Wow. Well, I might take some cues from your poster. I noticed that Claire asked a lot of open-ended questions. So she asked questions that can't just be answered with a yes or a no. She started a lot of her questions with big question words. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And, you know, Luke Burbank, to his credit, started doing this, but it faded out towards the end and it got more and more awkward. Claire also asked follow-up questions. Like when Tish said that she had been stood up on her date, Claire asks when, how she dealt with it, what she felt like. Kelsey, did you notice any interview stoppers?
I sure did. I'm going to pull off another piece of our poster here.
Okay.
Let's see. All right. So the first interview stopper that I noticed is asking yes or no questions. So one way to guarantee that you only get a one-word answer is to ask a yes or no question. So for example, in Luke's interview with Sigur Rós, he asks, so did you guys start out playing this type of music? And the band is like, yep. And so maybe a way that Luke could have gotten a different response might have been to ask something like, okay, guys, take me back to the first day you played music together. What was your sound like then? Using that what as a big question word. Another interview stopper is asking too many questions at once. You want to keep your interview questions simple and straightforward. And I'll give you one more. So here's a bonus interview stopper. Don't answer your own questions. There's a couple times in the Sigur Rós interview where Luke offers up possible answers to the questions that he asks. I'd say it's hard enough just asking the questions. You don't have to answer them too.
Kelsey, do you have some really big takeaways after listening to these two interviews?
I sure do, Simone.
I have a feeling
They're on the next piece of paper. All right. 5 big takeaways for interviewing. So number 1 is go in with a plan, but be open to going off script. So before every interview, you really want to make sure that you prepare. You want to research your interviewee, find out what they've said and what other people have said about them, and write down a big list of questions. But don't get so tied to that list of questions that you forget to do number 2, which is listen closely and respond. When you're interviewing someone, you want to give them your full attention and ask those follow-up questions that you were talking about earlier when they say something that really piques your curiosity. Number 3 is ask the big questions. So don't be afraid to ask big questions about things like maybe a time when a person was hurt or scared or confused. The worst thing that they can do is say, I'd rather not answer that question. So it's okay to really seek number 4, which is seeking out emotion and stories. So you can ask those big questions, and while you're asking those big questions, try to find the emotion and the stories. You can find data and numbers online, but the thing that you can't find just by Googling is someone's story or an emotion that's specific to them. One way that you can get to emotion and stories is by asking questions where the answer kind of needs to be a story. So you might say something like, take me back to the first day of school. How did your morning start? You can also ask sensory questions like, what did you see and what did it smell like? Number 5 on the list is good advice for interviewers and good advice just for human beings. And it is be kind, be present, and be curious. So Simone, do you have anything to add to our list?
I think that that pretty much sums it up. The one thing that I'd say is a little boring. It's logistical. Always schedule more time for your interviewer than you think you'll need. There's nothing worse than getting really into the rhythm of an interview and then they say, oh, I gotta go to work. So really make sure that you give yourself much more time than you think it's gonna take.
That's really good advice. That logistical advice is really important. Another good piece of logistics is always remember to bring backup batteries because you need them sometimes. All right, so Simone, I think it's time for questions and we've already got some coming in. So our very first question, I'll go ahead and take. Our first question is, do you need a specific degree to work at a radio station? So the answer to that is no, but you can. So like I talked about, I got a degree in journalism and you can get degrees in journalism. But the cool thing about journalism is that I like to think about it almost as a trade, almost like carpentry, because while you can and you should study journalism and theory, reading a book about journalism is never going to give you the same experience as actually going out and doing it. So you can become a journalist with any type of academic background. I'd say most or many of the folks at KUOW do have a college degree, but they're in vastly different fields. So some folks have studied journalism, some folks have studied similar topics like writing or communications, and some folks have degrees in business, political science, history. All of those things will give you the kind of well-rounded academic background that you need to be a journalist. So our next question is, as a journalist, are you told what stories to do, or do you think of your own? Simone, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. Well, I'll say that at the time that I was at KUOW over the summer, I was able to witness this magical thing called a pitch meeting. And all the reporters on the floor sort of gathered around one, I don't want to say cubicle because the walls were really low. It's not a standard office environment, but everybody sort of gathered around. And they started saying headlines. They started saying things that had happened to them, things that they had noticed. And I only realized that it was the pitch meeting that I was supposed to be shadowing halfway through when they started assigning stories to people. So I will say that you can pitch your own stories. Some reporters have a beat. So they have like a specific topic that they cover, whether it's like, there's like a food reporter sometimes, or there's a reporter on a specific idea. But from what I saw, there's an opportunity to pitch your own stories and it might be picked up. Does that sound like it answers the question to you all right, Kelsey? Cool.
Yeah, I think so.
The next question, yes. is, what do you do if an interview begins to go really badly? Do you want to take it or should I?
Do you want to?
I sure can. I, oof. I think that there's some things that you can do to try and prevent an interview from going badly. So like the planning is really, really important, at having a list of at least 10 questions before you walk into the room. So you have a through line, but sometimes you have people like Sigur Rós who don't just don't seem that interested in talking. And in that case, you can, there's a few options. You can scrap the story that you're working on if there's just no way to do it without them. You could look for a different person to interview, depending on what your timeline looks like. If you're doing it for yourself, that's maybe a great option. But if you're doing it and you have a deadline for your tape by tomorrow, then maybe it's not as good of an option. Or you can try and work with what tape you got. So if they gave you more than a 3-word answer on one of your questions, you can try and write around what the tape is that you have, where you're like, well, I asked them about this thing and this and this and this, and then there's a clip of them going, yes. And some pieces that might work on and some pieces that might not work on. But those are a few different ways that you can work around it. Yeah.
I think in the interview, I'll just add on to that. I think in the interview itself, you can just be honest with the person. I mean, you're a human being and they're a human being. And you can just say like, you know, is there something, what would you really like to talk about? Or is there something about the way I'm asking these questions that's making you not want to be a participant in this interview? So I think you don't have to be like a robot journalist person. You can just be a regular person and try to appeal to them on like a heart level. Let's see. I see a question about weird stories and cool stories. I can answer that one. Coolest story I ever covered was when a long time ago, when I was a very young journalist, I did a story about a group of dreamers. So young people who were undocumented, who had been brought into the country by their parents or caregivers as children. And that was one of my favorite stories I've ever done. Because I got to talk to a lot of people who were my age, who were just having very different experiences from me as a person who was born in the US. And then the next question is, what's the weirdest story you've ever covered? For me, I did a story on school lunches in Missouri and had to spend like a lot of time in elementary school lunchrooms talking to like 3rd graders about like their vegetables. So that was weird, but also fun.
That's like so much fun. Kids can make a really, really great interview. They can provide some awesome tape. I see that the next question looks like, what does an average day look like for a journalist, which I think I touched on earlier. I think somebody said this to me when I was at KUOW, was one of their favorite things about the job was how it was always changing. So what your day looks like as a journalist can change depending on what kind of story you're working on. And that could be really cool. It's in and out of the office. So you can be scripting, you can be editing, or you can be going to events as they're happening, like festivals or protests, and really being on the ground and getting that live coverage, which is really important. So it varies. I can say some constants are like, you're looking for stories, you're connecting with people, and you're doing a lot of writing, so.
And I'll add that most journalists at KUOW are working on a couple different stories at once. So you might have a longer, more in-depth story that you work on for days or weeks or months even. And then you also produce what are called spot stories. And every day, a couple different reporters are on spot duty. And so that means that if something breaking news happens that day, you're the person who's on call to go cover it. And so those stories you turn around in a day, the really, really fast, short spot stories. And so you might be working on those at the same time that you're working on one bigger story for, again, weeks or months. I see a question here. What's the biggest difference between being a radio journalist and writing for a newspaper? This is a really fun topic to think about, and there's a resource called NPR Training, which is a series of blog posts from NPR that talk about how to do radio journalism. So that's a great resource, and there's a great article in there called From Print to Radio Storytelling that talks about the difference between writing for a newspaper and producing radio stories. As far as ethics go, they're pretty similar, that you are always making sure that you're reporting the truth and you're reporting facts and you're fact checking your story. So both print and radio reporters go through a rigorous process of making sure that their story is accurate before it goes to print or goes to air, and that you've talked to a diverse group of people and that you're doing everything you can to represent an accurate story. But a big difference is writing for the eye versus writing for the ear. So print reporters write for the eye. And when you're a print reporter, you can write like long, flowery sentences with lots of big numbers because the reader can take their time. And however long it takes them to understand that sentence, they can spend with that sentence. But for radio reporters, most people listen to the radio like while they're driving in their car or while they're washing dishes. And so one, they can't rewind or reread a sentence. And two, they might be a little distracted. They're probably doing something else. And so radio reporters often write in short sentences with one idea per sentence to make sure that they get as much information to the listener, even if the listener is a little distracted. Let's see. Someone asked how many people work at KUOW. KUOW employs about 110 people, so it's a really big station. For comparison, the radio station that I worked at before coming to KUOW, KBIA in Columbia, Missouri, employs like 10 people, so KUOW is a big station. But it's not just reporters and producers that work there. There's a lot of people who work to keep the station running. So that includes all of the business side, so human resources and finance, as well as the membership side. I talked about how KUOW is funded by our listeners. And we have people on staff who work with our members, the people who donate to the station, to say thank you and to coordinate with them. We also have a marketing team and an events team. So there are a lot of different ways, jobs that you can do to work at KUOW that aren't necessarily being a journalist. Oh, Simone, this is a good question for you. It's, do you have favorite podcasts? And especially, do you have favorite podcasts that are good for people who want to be journalists to listen to?
Oh man. Well, I have a lot of favorite podcasts. I listen to many of them. I will say that when I have a lot of favorite fictional podcasts. So if you're looking for something with really good sound design, I like the Penumbra podcast. Is really good at placing you in somewhere, but that's more of like a long form fiction story. For podcasts to listen to for journalists, I think This American Life is classic, and a lot of people might have heard of it already. It plays on the radio sometimes. 99% Invisible is another one that's pretty classic. Gosh. Oh man, I can probably think of a few more. Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast that's pretty awesome. I would be willing to talk about podcasts all day. So I think I'll stop there. But I have a list of other recommendations that maybe I can put in the YouTube comment or something.
I'll shout out a couple more shows. So 2 shows from KUOW that are produced at KUOW. One is a new one called Seattle Now, which is a daily podcast, daily 10 minutes, so that when you wake up in the morning and you're brushing your teeth, you can find out what is going on in Seattle now. Another big podcast from KUOW is called The Wild, which explores the connection between humans and nature. And it's really great and it has gotten national recognition. Also, we've got to shout out the Radioactive podcast, where you can listen to stories produced by young people in Seattle and across Washington. A new season is about to drop on June 9th from Radioactive, where you'll hear all of the stories that have been produced by our youth producers this spring. And they're really, really good. And I'm not just saying that, they're pretty extraordinary. So that's exciting. Just search for Radioactive, one word, in your podcast apps. I will give a couple more resources though before we head out for the day. Two more podcasts that are great for people who want to be radio reporters. The first is called How Sound, HOWSOUND, one word. And it is a podcast with the backstory to great radio storytelling. So in How Sound, a producer named Rob Rosenthal looks at some great radio stories, and then he interviews the producers of those stories and finds out how that story was made. So that's a really great one for deconstructing great radio stories. Another podcast that I love about radio storytelling is called Tape, and it's by two young producers who interview great radio producers. So there's interviews with all types of people, with Ira Glass, with Sarah Koenig, with Julie Shapiro, on and on and on. It's really great. A couple more resources though.
Yeah.
Two websites I've mentioned already, but NPR Training and transom.org. TRANSOM is Transom. And both of those are just filled with blog posts about how to make great radio. Every topic you can imagine, from mixing and sound design to interviewing and storytelling, story structure, it's all there. So NPR Training and transom.org. And then two books. One is called Sound Reporting by Jonathan Kern. And it's like the textbook on how to make NPR style radio stories. And then my favorite resource is this book that I love. It's called Out on the Wire by Jessica Abel. And what's so cool about it is that it's a graphic novel. It's like a long comic, basically. And it's about how to make great radio stories. So it's just like a comic book. It's like part comic book, part textbook, but it's all about making radio. And it's just absolutely brilliant and fun to read. So those are my resource recommendations. And folks can also reach out to Radioactive Youth Media. I mean, our mission is to increase the number of youth voices we hear on the radio. We think youth voices aren't represented enough in media. So if you are a young media maker and have questions or need support, you can reach out to us, and you can find our contact information on our website, which is kuow.org/radioactive. Do you have anything to add before we wrap up here, Simone?
Oh man, I don't think I do, other than, we're on a social media at KUOW Radioactive. So you can feel free to reach out to us on Twitter, Instagram. I think we even have a TikTok. So we're incredibly hip. And somebody will get back to you there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll also shout out that we hire students to work with us every summer. And while our summer session has already started this summer, our next round of applications will open in March 2021. So while that feels maybe kind of far away, you can file that away that you can get paid to work with Radioactive Youth Media and KUOW. Every summer we open those applications. So be on the lookout for that. Once again, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon. We hope that you come back on Monday with a session with Alaska Airlines.
Sounds awesome. All right, bye everybody.